Henry Thompson sat quietly at a corner table in the bustling diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. At 75, the black veteran carried himself with quiet dignity, his modest but well-kept jacket a reflection of his meticulous nature. The afternoon crowd filled the space with cheerful conversation, while Henry occasionally glanced at the door, waiting for his son who was running behind schedule. The diner's door swung open, bringing with it Officers Daniels and Carter, their badges catching the light. Upon spotting Henry sitting alone in the predominantly white establishment, they exchanged knowing looks and snickered. Something about his presence bothered them, and they decided to make it their business. Approaching Henry's table, Officer Daniels immediately adopted an aggressive tone. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of courtesy. Henry looked up from his coffee, his voice steady as he explained he was waiting for someone. Officer Carter couldn't resist adding his own barb, mockingly commenting about a little old black man trying to fit in with the big boys, punctuating his words with a harsh laugh. Maintaining his composure, Henry repeated that he was simply waiting for his son. His calm demeanor seemed to provoke the officers further. Daniels demanded to see identification, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Henry produced his veteran's ID card, a testament to his years of service and sacrifice for his country. Daniels examined it with contempt, declaring it must be counterfeit with a dismissive sneer. The officer carelessly flicked the ID back across the table, while Carter added that it was hard to believe someone like Henry could be a veteran, suggesting that people like him were only fit for menial labor during Henry's era. Daniels nodded in agreement, reminiscing about what he called the good times when people like Henry knew their place. Their message was clear. They viewed Henry as an unwelcome outsider in this neighborhood. The diner fell into an uncomfortable silence as other patrons observed the scene unfolding before them. The usual chatter died down, replaced by tension, yet no one stepped forward to intervene. Through it all, Henry maintained his dignity. He had weathered worse storms in his lifetime, and he wouldn't let these young officers break his spirit. The confrontation escalated when Daniels issued an ultimatum: leave voluntarily or face forced removal. Their stance suggested they were prepared to use physical force to back up their threat. When Henry tried one final time to explain about waiting for his son, Daniels cut him off sharply. In their eyes, Henry was nothing more than a troublemaker who didn't belong in their jurisdiction, and they made it abundantly clear that they wanted anyone like him gone from the diner. The tension in the diner had reached its peak. The officers towered over Henry, waiting for him to either submit to their intimidation or provide them with an excuse for violence. Henry remained seated, meeting their gaze with unwavering composure, his hands steady on the table while other patrons watched in tense silence. Despite the humiliation of being targeted solely for his race, Henry knew that showing anger would only give the officers the pretext they sought for physical confrontation. He maintained his calm, hoping his son would arrive soon to end this unnecessary ordeal. His composed resistance visibly aggravated the officers, who were accustomed to immediate compliance with their demands. When Daniels issued one final ultimatum to leave, Henry took a deliberate sip of his coffee before responding quietly that he was simply a man waiting for his son, causing no trouble, and had every right to be there like anyone else. His measured response momentarily threw Daniels off balance. The diner remained silent, its patrons either too fearful or too indifferent to speak up, though the tension was palpable. Henry recognized the dangerous trajectory of the situation, but couldn't bring himself to back down. After a lifetime of confronting prejudice, this moment felt different. The veteran's ID in his pocket, proof of his service to his country, seemed to mean nothing to these young officers. He maintained his dignified stance even as they loomed over him, searching for any excuse to escalate. Without warning, Officer Daniels violently shoved Henry's chair, sending it crashing to the floor. The sudden noise drew every eye in the diner. Forced to stand, Henry maintained his composure as Daniels began an aggressive pat-down, muttering about making sure Henry wasn't hiding anything. Henry raised his hands slightly, not in submission but in compliance, knowing from past experience that staying calm could mean the difference between life and death, even as anger simmered beneath his surface. The irony wasn't lost on Henry. He had seen combat, survived experiences these young officers couldn't imagine, yet here he stood, treated like a criminal in the country he'd fought to protect. Officer Carter picked up Henry's veteran hat, worn and faded but deeply meaningful to Henry, and contemptuously tossed it to the floor, sneering that old cargo like Henry didn't deserve to wear it. For the first time, anger flickered across Henry's face, though he remained silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction they sought. The diner patrons gasped as Daniels suddenly grabbed Henry's wrist, twisting it behind his back, despite knowing the elderly man posed no threat. The officers laughed at Henry's grimace of pain, taunting that he wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Henry endured the pain without crying out, having survived worse physical and emotional wounds, but the disrespect toward his service cut deeper than any physical discomfort. "You are taking this too far," Henry finally spoke, his voice steady despite the pain. "You haven't seen half of the horrors I have encountered. I deserve better than this." His words were meant to remind them of their duty to protect and serve, but the officers interpreted his dignity as defiance, their expressions hardening with renewed hostility. "How dare you? You think you can tell us how to act?" Daniels snarled. "We'll show you who has power. You're sleeping in a cell tonight for rough handling of innocent cops. Let's see who will save a nobody like you." Daniels roughly secured handcuffs around Henry's wrists, but their cruelty wasn't finished. Carter picked up Henry's walking cane, a faithful companion of many years, and with deliberate malice snapped it in two across his knee before tossing the pieces aside. "You won't need this anymore," he sneered. "Where you're going." As they began dragging Henry toward the door, he spoke softly, gesturing with his chin toward a small card still lying on the table. Daniels, irritated but curious, snatched it up. His face drained of color as he read the bold letters on the simple reservation marker. "Commissioner Thompson." The realization struck him like lightning. They had been harassing, humiliating, and assaulting their police commissioner's father. Henry Thompson's life story was one of remarkable resilience and dignity. Born in the segregated South, he had learned early that the world showed little kindness to people who looked like him. Yet he had enlisted during the Vietnam War, choosing to serve a country that didn't recognize his equality. In the crucible of combat, he had witnessed unspeakable horrors, lost dear friends, and fought with unwavering courage. Though he earned his fellow soldiers' respect on the battlefield, he returned home to find that sacrifice counted for little in the face of persistent prejudice. Undaunted, Henry had built a life of quiet achievement. He had married, raised a family, and taken immense pride in watching his son Robert rise through the ranks to become police commissioner. Through countless challenges and setbacks, Henry had maintained his dignity, refusing to let the world diminish his spirit. Now, standing handcuffed by officers who had judged him solely by his skin color, he reflected on the bitter irony. A veteran who had risked everything for freedom was being treated like a criminal for simply existing in what these officers considered the wrong place. Officer Daniels stared at the reservation card in his trembling hands, the full weight of his actions crushing his former arrogance. He released Henry and began stammering apologies, trying to excuse their behavior by claiming ignorance of his identity. But Henry remained silent, his steady gaze more powerful than any words he could have spoken. The transformation in Officer Carter was equally dramatic. Their swaggering confidence evaporated, replaced by the cold realization of impending consequences. Shame painted their features as they stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. Around them, the once silent diners now pulled out phones to record the scene, sensing a moment of justice about to unfold. Through it all, Henry maintained the same calm dignity he had shown from the beginning. He didn't need to speak as he watched fear replace arrogance in the officer's eyes. The name on the card said everything necessary. They had chosen to humiliate a veteran who had served his country with honor, a man who had raised his son to become their superior officer, and now they would face the consequences of their prejudice and abuse of power. Henry had lived long enough to know that justice had its own way of emerging, even if not always as expected. His faith in his son remained unshaken, and he knew these officers would carry this day's lesson for the rest of their lives. The diner's door swung open, and Commissioner Robert Thompson entered with a commanding presence that immediately commanded attention. The room fell silent as he surveyed the scene before him, his father sitting quietly at the table, the two officers hovering uncomfortably nearby. Someone in the diner had recognized Henry and made the call. The commissioner's heart tightened at the sight before him. His father's disheveled clothes, the broken cane scattered on the floor, and the handcuffs still binding his wrists. Yet Henry's expression as he looked up at his son remained proud and dignified, unchanged by the ordeal he'd endured. Turning to face his officers, Commissioner Thompson spoke with quiet authority, asking them to explain themselves. Daniels and Carter, their earlier bravado evaporated, stumbled over their words as they tried to justify their actions. Their excuses centered on not knowing Henry's identity, as if that somehow absolved their behavior. The commissioner cut through their stammering with measured words that carried the weight of command. "It doesn't matter who my father is," he stated firmly. "Every person deserves respect, regardless of their background. This man is not only a citizen, but a veteran who served this country with honor. To treat anyone, especially a veteran, with such disgrace is unacceptable." Daniels and Carter stood in shameful silence, feeling the weight of every eye in the diner upon them. Commissioner Thompson's next words were brief but final. They were to leave immediately and report to his office first thing in the morning. The officers departed in silence, their heads bowed, knowing their careers would never be the same. With gentle care, the commissioner removed a key from his pocket and released his father from the handcuffs. As Henry rubbed his wrists, his son settled into the seat across from him. The commissioner's expression softened as he apologized both for his tardiness and for the treatment his father had endured at the hands of his officers, promising to make things right. But Henry waved away the apologies, his eyes filled with pride as he commended his son's handling of the situation. The two men shared a moment of peaceful understanding, a father who had maintained his dignity through decades of prejudice, and a son who had risen to power without forgetting the principles his father had taught him. The ripples of that day spread far beyond the diner's walls. The community rallied around Henry and his family, their outrage at the officers' conduct sparking renewed discussions about prejudice and respect. Under Commissioner Thompson's leadership, the police department launched a thorough investigation. Daniels and Carter faced serious consequences, a 6-month suspension without pay and mandatory retraining on prejudice and respectful conduct. Yet the most profound impact wasn't in the formal punishment, but in the quiet lesson taught by an elderly veteran who, despite facing humiliation and abuse, had maintained his dignity and shown that true strength lies not in the power to dominate others, but in the capacity to maintain one's principles even in the face of injustice. The diner incident became a watershed moment for both the police department and the community, a stark reminder that prejudice had no place in their society. Commissioner Thompson's decisive response that day set a powerful precedent, demonstrating to his officers and fellow citizens alike that justice and respect weren't mere words, but principles that demanded action. For Henry Thompson, while the confrontation stirred memories of battles fought both in foreign lands and on home soil, it also reinforced his faith in the future. In his son's unwavering response, he saw the fruition of the values he had worked so hard to instill. Through all the years of hardship and struggle, Henry had never lost hope that change was possible. Now, in his twilight years, he could take quiet pride in knowing that through his dignity, resilience, and the legacy he passed to his son, he had helped move that change forward, one difficult day at a time.